What does it take to destroy a career in Hollywood? For Charles Rocket, it wasn't a string of bad movies or a scandal that played out over months. This man was poised to become one of the biggest comedy stars of the 1980s. He had the looks, the talent, and the lead spot on the most important comedy show in the world. But with a single word, he lost it all. This isn't just the story of a famous mistake, it's the story of what happens after. A story of resilience, quiet desperation, and a final shocking act that reframes everything we thought we knew about the price of fame. To truly understand the story of Charles Rocket, you have to transport yourself back to a very specific moment in time, the turn of the decade, from the 1970s into the 1980s. America was in a strange, restless mood. The cynicism of Watergate and the Vietnam War still lingered in the air like stale smoke. The economy was a mess, with stagflation and gas lines dominating the news. But culturally, something electric was happening. In the cracks of all that uncertainty, a new kind of comedy was being forged. A comedy that was sharp, satirical, and unapologetically dangerous. At the epicenter of this cultural earthquake was a show that aired late on Saturday nights from Studio 8H in Rockefeller Center, Saturday Night Live. When it debuted in 1975, it wasn't just a TV show, it was a revolution. The original not ready for primetime players, Belushi, Aykroyd, Radner, Chase, they were rock stars. They were the voice of a generation that had grown weary of the polished laugh track perfection of traditional television. They were messy, unpredictable, and they held nothing sacred. They spoke truth to power, and they did it while dressed as killer bees or coneheads. But by 1980, that legendary era was over. The creator, Lorne Michaels, exhausted and burned out, had left. And with him, every single member of that iconic original cast and writing staff walked out the door. Imagine the pressure. It would be like trying to reboot the Beatles with an entirely new lineup of unknown musicians. NBC, desperate to keep its cultural cash cow alive, handed the keys to a new producer, Jean Doumanian, and tasked her with the impossible: rebuild a revolution from scratch. This was the world Charles Rocket was about to step into, a world of impossibly high expectations, a nervous network, and an audience just waiting to declare the new kids unworthy of the throne. It was a pressure cooker simmering on the highest heat, and the lid was about to blow. Before he was Charles Rocket, he was Charles Adams Clavery, born in Bangor, Maine in 1949. There was an artistic streak in him from the beginning. He didn't follow a traditional path. Instead, he enrolled at the prestigious Rhode Island School of Design in the late 1960s. RISD at that time was a vibrant, chaotic incubator for the avant-garde. It wasn't about learning to be a conventional painter or sculptor. It was about deconstructing art itself. It was a place where performance art, experimental film, and a general spirit of anti-establishment rebellion thrived. This environment profoundly shaped him. It instilled in him a certain fearlessness, a willingness to push boundaries that would become both his greatest asset and his most catastrophic liability. After college, he bounced around, a creative journeyman searching for a home. He played in a band called the Fabulous Motels. He even, in a twist of irony, became a local news anchorman for a time at stations in Colorado and Rhode Island. You can find old clips of him online, looking impossibly young and handsome, delivering the day's news with a straight-faced professionalism that gives no hint of the anarchic comedian simmering just beneath the surface. It's a fascinating duality, the clean-cut newsman learning the very rules of broadcast television that he would one day so spectacularly break. But the structured world of local news couldn't contain him. He was drawn to the more untamed frontiers of performance. He became deeply involved in the underground art scene, joining experimental theater troupes. This wasn't stand-up comedy in the traditional sense, it was confrontational, bizarre, and designed to provoke. He was honing a specific kind of persona, intelligent, sardonic, with a hint of danger behind his charming smile. By 1980, he had made his way to Los Angeles and was starting to get noticed. And that's when the call came. Jean Dumanian was scouring the country for her new cast of Not Ready for primetime players. She saw in Rocket the total package. He was leading man handsome, reminiscent of Chevy Chase, but he had the unpredictable intellectual edge of a Bill Murray. He was pegged from day one to be the breakout star of the new Saturday Night Live. He was given the coveted anchor chair at the weekend update desk, a position that had launched Chevy Chase into superstardom. The stage was set. The rocket, it seemed, was finally ready for launch. The sixth season of Saturday Night Live premiered on November 15th, 1980, and from the very beginning, something felt off. The chemistry wasn't there. The writing struggled to find its voice. The critics were merciless, unfavorably comparing the new cast to the legends they had replaced. It wasn't that the cast lacked talent. It included future stars like Eddie Murphy and Joe Piscopo, and brilliant character comedians like Gilbert Gottfried. But the weight of the legacy was crushing. Amidst the chaos, Charles Rocket was a clear standout. He was confident on camera, versatile, and possessed a natural charm. He was the designated leading man, appearing in more sketches than almost anyone else. He interviewed a real-life camel in a bizarre bit. He played slick game show hosts and smug doctors. He seemed to be the one cast member who wasn't drowning. In a sea of nervous energy, he projected an aura of cool control. But behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. The ratings were weak, the reviews were brutal, and Jean Dumanian's tenure as producer was hanging by a thread. The cast felt like they were on a sinking ship, and a sense of gallows humor and desperation began to set in. And that desperation reached its peak on the night of February 21st, 1981. The host was Charlene Tilton, one of the stars of the #1 show in America, Dallas. The entire country was gripped by the show's Who Shot JR cliffhanger. SNL, naturally, decided to parody it with a running sketch throughout the episode where Charles Rocket, playing a JR-like character, would get shot by a different cast member at the end of each scene. It was during the episode's goodnights, the final moments of the live broadcast. The cast was gathered on stage with Tilton. It's a moment that's usually filled with hugs, waves, and relieved smiles. Tilton, playing along with the night's theme, asked Rocket how he felt after being shot so many times. He was sitting in a wheelchair, pretending to be wounded. He looked into the camera, and with a weary, half-joking sigh, he had lived a line that would echo through television history. "Oh man," he said, slurring his words slightly. "I'd like to know who the fuck did it." In the control room, there was instantaneous panic. On television in 2025, a word like that might get bleeped on a reality show. But it wouldn't necessarily end a career. But in 1981, on live network television, it was the nuclear option. The three major networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, were the gatekeepers of American culture, and they operated under a strict set of standards and practices enforced by the FCC. The F word was the ultimate taboo, a line that was simply never, ever crossed. The immediate reaction in the studio was a stunned silence, followed by nervous laughter. Most of the cast seemed to register the gravity of what had just happened. But the damage was done. The phone lines at NBC immediately lit up with complaints from angry viewers across the country. Affiliates threatened to drop the show. Advertisers were furious. It was a full-blown corporate crisis. For Charles Rocket, the fallout was swift and brutal. While he later insisted it was an unintentional slip, a genuine mistake made in a moment of exhausted ad-libbing, the network didn't see it that way. In their eyes, it was the final unforgivable failure of a season that had been a disaster from the start. Weeks later, NBC fired John Dumanian and brought in a new producer, Dick Ebersol, to salvage the show. Ebersol's first order of business was a complete house cleaning. He fired most of the cast, including Gilbert Gottfried and Anne Risley. But Charles Rocket was the public face of the fiasco. He wasn't just fired, he was publicly exiled. His name became synonymous with the spectacular failure of the 1980 to 81 season. That one word, uttered in a fleeting moment of what might have been either recklessness or exhaustion, had effectively detonated his burgeoning career. He had been positioned as the next Chevy Chase. Now he was a pariah. Imagine the psychological toll. To be on the absolute cusp of superstardom, to have the entire industry telling you that you are the next big thing, only to have it all violently snatched away because of a 2-second lapse in judgment. It's more than just losing a job. It's public shaming. Overnight, Charles Rocket became a punchline, a cautionary tale. The incident was a scarlet F branded onto his professional reputation, a mistake that would be mentioned in the first paragraph of nearly every article written about him for the rest of his life. Friends and colleagues from that era spoke of a noticeable change in him. The easy, confident charm was still there, but it was now tinged with a deep-seated melancholy. He had been married to his college sweetheart, Mary, since the early 70s, and they had a son. Now, he was not just a disgraced actor, he was a husband and father facing an uncertain future, trying to provide for his family under the immense shadow of his public blunder. There has always been a debate surrounding that fateful night. Was it truly a slip of the tongue, or was it something more? Given his background in confrontational anti-establishment performance art, some have theorized that it was a deliberate act of rebellion, a final defiant gesture from a man on a creatively bankrupt, sinking ship. A way of saying, if we're going down, let's go down in flames. We will never know for certain what was in his mind in that moment. But whether it was an accident or an act of artistic sabotage, the consequences were the same. In many ways, he became the perfect scapegoat. The 1981 season was a failure long before he uttered that word. The writing was weak, the new cast hadn't gelled, and the pressure to live up to the original lineup was an impossible burden. His on-air mistake was the convenient headline-grabbing excuse the network needed to justify wiping the slate clean and starting over. Charles Rocket didn't kill the show, but he was the one sent to the gallows for its death. What do you do when your dream explodes? You could disappear. You could change careers. Or you could pick up the pieces and start building something new, even if it's smaller and quieter than the grand cathedral you had once envisioned. Charles Rocket chose to build. And this is, in many ways, the most admirable and quietly heroic chapter of his story. He didn't quit. He didn't vanish. He went back to work. He became the quintessential character actor throughout the 1980s and 1990s. His face was everywhere. He put his head down and carved out a new career, piece by piece, role by role. He brought a memorable, quirky energy to the sci-fi comedy Earth Girls Are Easy. He was a formidable presence as the rigid Lieutenant Spivey in Kevin Costner's Oscar-winning Dances with Wolves. He guest starred on some of the biggest TV shows of the era, from the slick detective series Moonlighting to the surreal sci-fi of Max Headroom and later Star Trek Voyager. He was a professional's professional, always prepared, always delivering, no matter the size of the part. And of course, there were the two roles that cemented his place in pop culture for a new generation. In 1993's Hocus Pocus, he was Dave, the perfectly normal, slightly goofy dad who is completely oblivious to the supernatural chaos engulfing his children. He's the grounding force in a whirlwind of magic, the relatable everyman just trying to get through Halloween. A year later, he delivered his most iconic performance as the sophisticated, menacing villain Nicholas Andre in Dumb and Dumber. It's a masterful comedic performance. He plays the role completely straight, which makes the absurdity of Harry and Lloyd's antics even funnier. His deadpan delivery, his cold, calculating stare, and his simmering frustration create a perfect foil for Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels. He was never the star, but he made the stars shine brighter. This body of work is a testament to his resilience. He may never have regained the leading man status that SNL had promised, but he built a long and respectable career. He worked constantly. He supported his family. He continued to practice his craft with dignity and skill. But one has to wonder if the ghost of that night in 1981 ever truly left him. Did he ever feel that no matter how many good performances he gave, he would always be remembered for his one great mistake? As the new millennium began, Charles Rocket seemed to retreat from the hustle of Hollywood. He had moved his family years earlier to a quiet farm in Canterbury, Connecticut. It was a world away from the spotlight, a place where he could perhaps find a measure of peace. He continued to act, taking on voice work for animated shows like the new Batman adventures and video games, but his on-screen appearances became less frequent. What was happening in his private life during these years is something we can only piece together from the tragic events that followed. It's clear now that behind the wry smile and the sardonic wit, Charles Rocket was fighting a profound and debilitating battle with depression. It's a cruel irony that so many of the people who dedicate their lives to making us laugh are so often plagued by such immense private pain. The mask of the comedian can be the heaviest one to wear. On October 7th, 2005, his wife returned to their farm to a scene of unimaginable horror. Charles Rocket was found dead in a field on his property. He was 56 years old. The state medical examiner later confirmed that his death was a suicide. The manner in which he chose to end his life was particularly brutal and violent, a horrifying testament to the depth of the despair he must have been feeling. The farm was supposed to be the epilogue to his Hollywood story, a quiet retreat in the rolling hills of Canterbury, Connecticut, where the noise and judgment of the industry couldn't reach him. He had built a life there with his family, away from the glare of the spotlight that had both made and broken him. But peace, it seems, is not a location you can simply move to. It's a battle waged from within. The silence of the countryside, which for some is a comfort, can for others become a cavern where dark thoughts echo louder than ever. We will never know the full story of his final days or the specific catalyst for his final act, but it is devastatingly clear that he was fighting a war no one could see, a brutal internal conflict that ultimately consumed him. The news sent a shockwave through the entertainment community. Tributes poured in from those who had worked with him, all expressing a similar sentiment: shock, sadness, and a profound sense of loss for a man they remembered as kind, intelligent, and wickedly funny. But for the public, it was a jarring and tragic final chapter to a story they only knew in broad strokes. The SNL F-bomb guy, the villain from Dumb and Dumber, had taken his own life in the most devastating way possible. The contradiction was almost too much to bear. And perhaps that contradiction was the key to his entire persona all along. Charles Rocket was never just a goofy slapstick comedian. Even in his silliest roles, his humor was always sharper, more intelligent, and tinged with a certain sardonic distance. He often played the man who seemed to be in on the joke, observing the absurdity of the world around him with a knowing smirk. Looking back now, one can't help but wonder if that persona was a kind of armor. Was the wit a defense mechanism, a sophisticated shield to keep the world at arm's length? The very intelligence that made him so funny may also have been the source of a profound and isolating pain, allowing him to see the world's flaws and perhaps his own with a clarity that eventually became unbearable. So, what is the legacy of Charles Rocket? It's tempting to define him by that one single fateful word uttered on live television, to see his life as a simple tragedy, a story of what might have been. But that does a disservice to the man he was and the life he lived in the 24 years that followed. His story is a powerful, if painful, reminder of the unforgiving nature of fame and the disproportionate weight a single mistake can carry. In today's world of fleeting internet outrage, it's hard to conceive of a single verbal slip having such catastrophic, career-long consequences. He was, in a very real sense, a casualty of a different era's standards, but his life after the scandal is also a story of quiet dignity and incredible resilience. It's the story of a craftsman who, after being knocked off the main stage, dedicated himself to perfecting his work in the wings. He brought intelligence and depth to every role he played, elevating the material and leaving behind a body of work that is more substantial and varied than many people realize. Perhaps the most important lesson from the life and death of Charles Rocket is about the battles we don't see. He was a TV funny man, a person whose job was to entertain, to make people smile. Yet, he carried a burden of pain so heavy that he ultimately felt he could no longer bear it. His death is a stark and heartbreaking call for empathy, a reminder that behind every public face there is a private and complex human being who may be struggling in ways we can't begin to imagine. So the next time you're watching Hocus Pocus with your family, or laughing at the antics in Dumb and Dumber, take a moment to remember the man behind the role. Don't just remember him as that guy or as the subject of an old TV scandal. Remember Charles Rocket, the artist, the pioneer, the survivor, the father, the husband, a man of immense talent whose life was a complex tapestry of brilliant light and profound darkness. A life that serves as a solemn reminder of how quickly a rocket can fall and how important it is to be kind to those who are trying to find their way back in the dark.